Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about counting macros versus the actual quality of your food and body composition. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. Because this is, one of these controversial topics, and it's something that we really need a more balanced look at, because we do have these two opposing viewpoints. And now oftentimes the people on the macro accounting side will point out that this can be a bit of a straw man. But unfortunately it isn't, because there are actually a large number of people out there who I have met and observed who really do follow the nonsense of the total junk food macro accounting approach. So a lot of them will argue when we talk about this that, well, a lot of them eat plenty of their vegetables and everything else, and that's true, but that doesn't get emphasized enough. And we literally do see a bunch of people out there, and I've seen them over the years, even YouTubers, who just do the junk food approach. But the idea is that really all that matters for your body composition changes are your macros. In other words, any carbs are the same, all protein is the same, all fat is the same, etc., at least within a reasonable margin of error in terms of its effects on body composition. Whereas in people on the other side say, no, food quality is more important. The truth is, though, is that both people are technically right. And what I mean is the data is pretty overwhelming on it. And we have plenty of people who've proven it with their own anecdote, even researchers who've done it, everything else. Your calories, carbs, fat, protein, all of that is what affects your body composition directly. In other words, if you can successfully, here's the key, if you can successfully get most of your carbs from table sugar while maintaining a caloric deficit, you will absolutely lose body fat, right? That shouldn't even be a subject of debate. You can argue all you want about insulin response and everything else, but that doesn't actually directly affect weight loss. In other words, insulinogenic foods with a very large insulin response, or highly refined foods, do not interfere with fat loss in any way beyond their caloric content. The data is overwhelming for that. It's overwhelming. And anyone arguing otherwise at this point, it just basically sounds like a scientifically illiterate moron. They really do, because it's provable. It's provable, been looked at very, very closely, repeatedly. Now, the issue we run into, though, is one of what we think about as energy and appetite. So when we start coming over to the food quality end, they're technically right. And in the short term, you can get away with the other. And in fact, there are people who, if they just work in even a cheat meal type thing every day, where they eat some junk food every night before bed, but they track everything else meticulously, and they're still in a caloric deficit, they're getting all their protein, everything else, they'll continue to lose body fat, retain muscle well, they can change their body composition just fine. That's actually true, and that does work if you can sustain it. The issue we get into, though, with if you're doing too much junk food, you're not getting enough food quality. The things that you have to factor in are, number one, nutritional deficiencies. And if you start developing nutritional deficiencies, that can affect your performance. That can affect your energy, everything else. Well, if your performance in the gym goes down because you're not getting enough quality food, you're getting deficient in something, that will start to affect both your fat loss, your muscle retention, your muscle gains, everything else. That will start to affect it if you cannot train as hard or with the same workloads, and you're having recovery issues, energy issues, everything else due to a dietary deficiency. Well, that will become a problem. But in the short term, that won't affect you. People need to understand that. Dietary deficiencies take a little while to happen. They don't just happen instantly in a week. So if someone's on a deficient diet because of this, guess what? Over time, they will start to have problems. And then we deal with the appetite end of it. So it comes down to dietary adherence. And this is where people are different, and this is where the real argument occurs. And this is where the people who argue more for food quality, where they're actually right. Because we start looking at the more long-term approach with it, if you're eating a lot of foods that don't fill you up, they're not particularly satiating, and you have appetite issues, this can become a problem. This can really become a problem for you in the long term, as far as adhering to your diet. Because all these people say, oh, well, just count your macros. Well, that's also the same as just telling people to eat less. That's the exact same thing. There's literally no difference. When people say, oh, I struggle with fat loss, or I've hit a fat loss plateau, and someone tells them just count your macros, what you really mean to say is you just need to eat less. There's no difference between the two, and if they're struggling to eat less, counting your macros isn't going to matter. You take someone like me, and who has a voracious appetite, right? And I lose weight on 3,000 calories. I can lose 2 pounds a week on 3,000 calories a day easily. But you take someone like me and tell me, oh, well, just count your macros and eat whatever you want and just fit it into your macros. Well, that's easier said than done. For someone like me, I can eat 2,000 calories of low satiety food and still be hungry afterwards and be hungry 2 hours later. That's a problem, particularly with the wrong food. So that isn't always a viable solution. So for someone like me, in order to even work those foods in, there's a lot of meal timing required. There's a lot of protein and everything required, and I get away with it. I've been cutting. I'm down 46 pounds right now. But for me to do that and to work in these treat foods, I generally have to do them late in the evening. If I decide I'm going to do something like that for someone like me, meal timing matters. My protein content matters. It's things like loading up on protein, vegetables, stuff like that earlier in the day and saving those calories for the evening. Now, someone like me, I can get away with that. But when it comes down to simple, just count your macros, well, that's not always going to work because we deal with people's appetites. We deal with satiety. So the direction I would say with a lot of that is that, well, it's not always true. And people who are going to count their macros and do this, that's well and good, but you better have strategies in place for dietary adherence that go beyond just counting your macros. And if you're one of those people who can just count their macros and their appetite is fine and they eat whatever they want, you're not the person who struggles with fat loss. You're not the person who struggles with weight loss. You're someone who has an easier time at this. And just about any approach would probably work for you. The clean eating approach would actually work just as well for that person. If they just did the chicken, broccoli, and brown rice thing, that person would do just as well because they clearly don't have an absurd appetite. But I guess what this comes down to is making sure, whichever approach that you take here, that you need to have balance in the sense of you do need to make sure that you're in a caloric deficit if you want to lose body fat. You do need to make sure that you're in a caloric surplus if you want to gain muscle. At least if you want to do either one in an ideal manner. So that's something that people on the quality end do need to understand. That's something they do need to understand. And then the people on the other end who are saying, well, just macros matter. Well, only in the short term. Your food quality is going to matter. You really need to make sure that if you're going to use that approach and you're going to weigh out your 300 calories of ice cream or whatever it is you do every day, and that's fine, but you need to understand that the total quality of your diet matters. And just popping a multivitamin to make sure you get your vitamins and minerals is a piss poor way to do it. I would argue that that's an absurd way to go about it. Best of luck with that. Most of the people I know who use that approach, they end up failing. A lot of people we see out there who use that approach, I'm not going to name names, they've run into their own depression issues, all sorts of problems, everything else, and they never followed a balanced diet with any of this. In all honesty, that's a very disordered way to go, and you will very easily develop vitamin deficiencies if you're not careful, particularly if you're training really hard, if that's your solution. Oh, just eat whatever you want and pop a multivitamin and count your macros. That approach is absurd. So people who want to count macros, they do need to still grasp at the end of the day, food quality is definitely, may not matter as much for you personally for appetite, but for someone else you're giving advice to, it is going to matter. And you do need to understand food quality is going to affect your energy over time. It's going to affect your micronutrients, and you just need to make sure that you are getting these things in. In other words, if you decide you're going to go out for sliders and Guinness in the evening, later that day and just work it into your macros, you probably want to fill up on chicken and broccoli through most of the day leading up to that would just be my advice there. Again, making sure that you at the very least hit your protein needs, make sure you're getting all your vitamins and minerals and everything that you need from whole foods before you try to work in these other treat foods. That way you don't develop any deficiencies, your appetite ends up being better, because that is something that's been noted also. There's not only food volume involved with appetite control, there does seem to be some evidence out there that foods that are too low in certain vitamins and minerals oftentimes lead to satiety issues as well. So the truth is that both sides are technically right in this argument. And both sides would do well to make sure that they understand what the other one is saying here. And there are a lot of people out there on one side or the other who do grasp the argument well. They just still choose to lean in that other direction. But the reality is there's actually a middle ground. The truth of the matter is more in the middle ground between these two, the two far extreme philosophies of this. And when those two communicate better, you do get that middle ground where the truth is that Macros absolutely do matter more than hormones and everything else. Total calories, carbs, fat, protein, all that matters tremendously. But food quality absolutely does affect things like energy, recovery, appetite, all of those things, and those are going to be important factors. In other words, if you want to successfully track your macros and your calories in, calories out, and perform ideally, the overall quality of your diet is still tremendously important beyond the carbs, fat, and protein. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.